In this video, we're looking at the impact of globalization on Africa. And the question is, how did globalization underdevelop Africa? All right, for us to understand this deeper, let's take a look at the definition of globalization. It says here, growing interdependence. This is very important. Growing interdependence and integration of the world's economies. Very important. This is globalization, the growing interdependence. They cannot separate. There is no divorce. They are all together. They are all weaved together. Economies, cultures, technology, social, right? Social life. As a matter of fact, let's come back to technology. Technology, all intertwined. Countries sharing technology. Institutional and populations, right? Population here means migration. So people moving from one country to the other, from one continent to the other, mixing, intermingling, migration happening. The type of migration we have seen in the last 10 years, we've never seen it. And this is part of the globalization trend, prompted, right, by free flow of information. So countries sharing information. Right? So countries share information on a number of things, on economics, and on goods, on trade, on technology, on commerce. The free flow of information, technology, transnational activities, economic activities, very, very important. Transnational economic activities and trade in goods and services. This is globalization. This is the meaning of globalization. Countries intertwined, economies all tangled together, cultures, technology, institutions, populations moving in all three. And that's why if one country has economic challenges, it affects other countries because other countries are depending on that country, because the economies of other countries are tied to that country, especially if the country is a big one like China and the United States, Brazil and Canada and so forth, those big countries with big economies, Germany, UK, the rest of the world suffers. That is globalization. That is the definition of globalization, and that's what it means. Now the question is, how does it impact Africa? Let's take a closer look at this question. All right, so again, the question is, how did globalization underdevelop Africa? Right, so globalization is supposed to be furthering economic goals, it's supposed to be developing countries and continents and so forth. But in the case of Africa, it appears to have had the reverse effects. So let's take a look at this closely. Okay, so here it says capital flight. What does that mean? Right? So it means that the multinational corporations, because of globalization, they are able to travel to Africa, to the different countries in Africa. This is the continent. Different countries in Africa. They come from Latin American countries. Over here. They come from Europe. They come from the Americas. Right? And they establish companies all over the continent. And they make money while on the continent. And they make billions of money. Right? While on the continent. And guess what? All of that money goes away back to North America, back to Latin America, back to Asia, in some cases Middle East as well. That is capital flight, right? So the money is made in Africa, but the money doesn't stay in Africa. It doesn't stay in Africa to develop the continent. It doesn't stay in Africa to build capacity and to add to the development of the continent. Rather, the money, billions of dollars, are taken away, right, to different parts of the world. That's capital flight. And that's not good for the continent. And that's one of the setbacks of globalization on Africa. And this is one of the ways globalization has underdeveloped Africa. The second point is the export of raw materials and resale of those materials. Africa has so many raw materials, gold, uranium, oil, the list is long. Africa has all of those. And these multinational corporations come in, they mine for those things, they mine for the minerals, they take the minerals away, they develop the minerals out of the continent and resell them to the continent. right? And this is a very important point here. So they take the minerals, they take the raw materials out of the continent to China, to Europe, to the Americas, to Latin America, and they refine them and sell them back to African countries. That's what this means. Export of raw materials and resale of those materials. And in some cases, they sell them to other countries as well. They make money. They come and they get coffee bean, for example, in Ethiopia. And they take them out of the continent. This is how globalization impacts Africa negatively. The export of raw materials and resale of those materials. Okay, loss of sovereignty. The third point. African countries lose their sovereignty. Now, these countries are supposed to be independent. Let's clear this up. So, African countries lose their sovereignty to the different countries. Again, North America, Europe is here, UK is part of Europe as well, but not part of the European Union, Latin America, Asia, right? They lose their sovereignty to different countries outside the continent because these countries, these multinational corporations, backed by countries in most cases, they come in and they have their way. They don't go by the laws of the countries in Africa. In some cases, they don't pay taxes, right? If they pay taxes, very little taxes. In some cases, they pollute the environment and no consequences. There are no consequences, right? And they walk away. African countries have lost their sovereignty in that sense because they are not holding these corporations accountable. There is no accountability. This is accountability. There's no accountability by those corporations. And the African governments have lost the sovereignty. They've lost the authority over these companies. And that is what it means, right? And that's what it means. They are at the mercy of these companies because these companies in some cases have more money, more capacity than some of the African countries. And some of the leaders are compromised. And they sell the sovereignty for very little money. That's what it means. That is what globalization has done to Africa. And the final point here is lower wages. They pay lower wages to African workers, just peanuts, take away the materials and develop the materials outside the continent, sell them for huge profit, and the workers in Africa get nothing. So for example, the workers in Ethiopia who cultivate the beans for coffee get paid like 50 cents a day. 50 cents a day. And if you go to any coffee company in the West, you can't get a cup of coffee for 50 cents. You get it for $2, $1.50, $2.50, $3, depending on the quality and depending on the company. But the workers that have made it possible get paid 50 cents a day. Not 50 cents an hour, 50 cents a day. Lower wages. That cannot be good for the continent. So the question once again is, how did globalization underdevelop Africa? Capital flight. Money's leaving the continent. The multinational corporations making the money and taking the money out of the continent in the billions. The money does not remain in the continent to develop the continent, build capacity. Export of raw materials and reselling those materials to the continent. What does that mean? I've given an example of how to get coffee beans from Ethiopia, take it out, right? Make coffee out of it, and in some cases, resell the finished product. Same thing with cocoa in Ghana. Get the cocoa out, make chocolate out of it, resell the chocolate to African countries. Export of raw materials and reselling them. Same thing with crude oil. Get crude oil, send them out of the country, refine them, and sell it back to African countries. That's one way globalization has negatively impacted the continent. Loss of sovereignty, African countries essentially giving up their authority to these multinational corporations and countries outside the continent to come in and do whatever they want with no consequences, with no regard for the environment, no regard for the people, and lower wages, paying lower wages to African workers to get these raw materials together for shipment to other parts of the world. That is how globalization has impacted Africa in a negative way. So the question is, what can African governments do about it? They have to sit up, they have to take responsibility, they have to protect their people, they have to have their country's national interest at heart. They have to protect their people from foreign companies that are bent on exploiting the people and exploiting the raw materials. Again, has globalization been good for Africa? Well, the answer is so far, it has not been good for Africa, and these are the reasons. Capital flight, export of raw materials and reselling them, loss of sovereignty, and lower wages.